Blink number 5. Micromaster baking artisan bread with 3 entry tricks. If you don't feel like learning how to surf or don't have access to a beach, why not try to micromaster baking artisan bread? To illustrate just how handy entry tricks are to jump-starting the micromastery of any skill, here are 3 examples related to baking bread. The first entry trick is dedicating a whole day to bread making. Baking is a lengthy process, and a lack of time will surely throw off your bread game. Therefore, you need to make sure you allocate enough hours to prepare not only for the baking time, but also for preparing the dough. You don't want to cut any corners, as the results won't be nearly as good. The second entry trick is to keep the dough wet. To combat the stickiness of the dough, many people add more flour to their hands, to the kneading surface, and to the dough itself. This is counterproductive, however, as your dough will become heavier and more difficult to bake. What you should do instead is use a bit of olive oil on the kneading surface and your hands, which will remove some of the stickiness while keeping the dough light. Entry trick number 3 is to use good flour, dry yeast, and warm water. For example, you can use super strong organic Canadian flour either as is or mixed evenly with common bread flour. Dry yeast, meanwhile, is a lot easier to control than wet yeast, so it's good for beginners. Once all the ingredients are combined, the dough needs to be kneaded for roughly 10 minutes. That means 10 minutes of stretching and pummeling. To check that it's been kneaded enough, break off a small piece of the dough and slowly pull it apart. If it stretches to the point that it appears almost transparent, then it's ready for proving, which we'll learn more about in the final blink. Blink number 6. In addition to observing time and temperature, baking requires equipment, tasting, repetition, and experimentation. After the entry trick, there are 5 more steps involved in micromastering baking bread. The next step is the rub-pat barrier. In this case, it involves balancing temperature and time during proving, which refers to when the dough rises due to the addition of yeast before being put in the oven. Balancing time and temperature is important because the yeast will die if the dough is kept at an air temperature of over 40 degrees Celsius. On the one hand, if kept at a higher temperature, the bread will have more flavor. On the other hand, at a lower temperature, the dough can prove for longer. To balance time and temperature just right, heat your oven up to 50 degrees Celsius, switching it off just before you put the dough in for proving. Both the dough and the bowl holding it will absorb the residual heat, and the dough will reach the optimal temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. When you can stick 2 fingers into the dough and the indent remains or slowly rises back up, the proving is done. Then comes the kneading, which you will do for about 10 minutes before proving the dough again, though this time in a baking tin. Following these steps, your bread should expand in size by 150 to 200%. The third element to micromaster baking bread involves background support. So, in addition to good flour, you will need the right equipment. This includes measuring scales, a surface on which to knead the dough, and so forth. Go after what's easiest to use without sacrificing quality. The fourth step is the immediate payoff, which in this case is the taste and smell of freshly baked bread. Who wouldn't prefer fresh homemade bread to dry, store-bought loaves? The next element is repetition, and with baking, you can easily turn it into a weekly routine. To ensure that you don't miss a week of baking, keep your cupboard stocked with the necessary supplies. The last element is experimentation, which baking definitely allows for. Just think of all the different quantities you can include of each ingredient, as well as the different types of ingredients you can add. You can experiment with the proving time or with different flavors. Why not try adding olives to your next batch? So now that you know the basic steps of micromastery, you're ready to take on any new skill, whether it be surfing, baking, or something else entirely. You've just heard our blinks to Micromastery by Robert Twigger. The key message of this book is that learning something new can sometimes be overwhelming and can demotivate us from sticking with it. That's why it's much more efficient to learn various smaller tasks quickly and work your way gradually toward mastering a skill, which is a method called micromastery. Micromastery involves 6 main elements: an entry trick, the rub-pat barrier, background support, immediate payoff, repetition, and experimentation. So how can you apply the concepts of these blinks to your own life? Why not draw perfect circles? To become a master at drawing, you first need to micromaster drawing circles. Coordinate time and accuracy until you can quickly and easily draw perfectly round circles. Find a good pen and keep practicing until you get it right. After that, you can start adding details to the circles and create some circular designs.